Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the November Core Advocates webinar. Tonight we'll be talking about connecting the criteria for high-quality assessments to standards and shifts-aligned instruction. And we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. While you're waiting, I would encourage you to download the handout for tonight. We're going to have you actually taking notes as we progress through our content and sharing some of your thinking with us periodically. So take a few moments, access that handout on the handouts panel, and we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the November Core Advocates webinar on connecting the criteria for high-quality assessments to standards and shifts-aligned instruction. I'm Joni Funderburk from the Field Impact Team at Student Achievement Partners, and I'm joined tonight by my colleagues Sandra Alberti, Janelle Fan, Jenny Beltramini, and Linda Nguyen, as well as our guests on tonight's webinar, Ostrid Fossum and Katie Cowan, as well as Christy Gettleman, our Core Advocate guest. We're all excited to be sharing some information with you tonight. For those on the call who are not familiar with Core Advocates, the Core Advocate Network is a national teacher network of educators who believe in the potential of college and career-ready standards to prepare all students for college and careers, who are eager to support their colleagues and their communities in understanding and advocating for these standards and standards-aligned instruction, and who understand and embrace the shifts in instruction and assessment, as we'll be talking about tonight, that are required by these standards. If you'd like to learn more about the Core Advocate Network, you can contact me or my colleague Jenny directly. Our emails are here on the screen for you. You can also join our database, and you'll be added to our mailing list using this link, the bit.ly.com/ www.achievethecore.org/join Core Advocates. And you can find out more about the Core Advocates program also on our website, achievethecore.org. We have lots of tweeters in our Core Advocate Network, and we would encourage those of you who are active on Twitter to live tweet tonight. Please use the hashtag Core Advocates, and be sure that you follow us at AchieveTheCore. And all of our presenters that are on Twitter, our handles are here as well. Please include us on your tweets tonight. We'd love to hear from you and your learning during the webinar. I'd also like to let you know that during the webinar, we'll be asking you to access documents. There is one handout under the Handouts tab of your control panel, and we will be having you interact with that handout quite a bit tonight. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and download that so that you have access to it. We'll also be asking you some questions, getting your feedback on portions of the webinar, and you can send us questions at any time or responses to our questions using that Questions tab. You'll also see several polls in tonight's webinar, and the polls will just pop up on your screen, and you can interact with them directly when you see that happen. After the webinar, you'll receive a survey from us, and we really appreciate your feedback. We use it to make our webinars better every single month. And you'll also receive access to the recorded version of the webinar and all the webinar materials. So before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Jenny to talk about instructional advocacy.
Thanks, Tony. We hope that you all will be instructional advocates at the end of this webinar. So instructional advocates are educators who are grounded in a firm understanding of the shifts and who own, support, and promote resources, tools, and practices that create learning environments in which students develop college and career readiness. We hope as a result of participating in this webinar, you'll leave with a better understanding of the shifts in assessment and with ideas and resources related to assessment that you'll want to implement and share with your colleagues. So after the webinar, we'd love to hear from you about how you take the ideas and resources related to assessment and use them or share them with your colleagues. You can use our instructional advocacy action form to tell us about what you've done. It's hyperlinked here on the PowerPoint, which you'll receive via email after the webinar. We'll also follow up with you in about a month and email you the link to the form so you can tell us all about what you've used and what you've been able to share from tonight's webinar.
Oh, we're not on mute anymore? Okay, sorry. So I've been talking to myself about the goals for tonight's webinar. Luckily, you all can read them here on the screen. So real quickly, we hope that after the webinar or by the end of the webinar tonight, you will recognize the shifts for ELA and math in high-quality assessments. You'll have a chance to reflect on how shifts-aligned instruction and assessments support student learning and achievement. And you'll learn about some tools that you can use to ensure that your own classroom assessments are of high quality. And I just want to mention that throughout the webinar tonight, you'll hear us talking about the Common Core state standards. And if you're from a state where that isn't necessarily friendly language or where your state has updated the standards, we just want to be sure that we make clear that the information we're sharing tonight is relevant across the board, that we are talking about good practices and relevant to all types of standards. So we ask for your flexibility as we encounter those parts tonight. So we're going to start by answering this question: how can the characteristics of high quality assessments help shape classroom instruction and assessment practices in ELA literacy? And I want to remind you to utilize your handout. So as we go through this next section, please jot down the things that are striking you as relevant implications for classroom instruction and assessment practices, because we're going to be asking you to share your ideas with us in a little bit. But before we dive into this content, we're going to start with a question for you.
Hello. What words, phrases, sentences do you associate with high-quality standards-aligned ELA instruction? Please use your question tab to answer this question.
Great, so we got some terrific responses. It's always good to see common use of language, and so some of the things that we heard from you were things like complex, rigorous, evidence-based, but then some interesting additional concepts like text-centered, text-first, one that I especially loved, worthy of students' attention, text-dependent questions, content-rich, complex ideas. And I just want to remind you that our GoToWebinar doesn't allow you to see everybody's responses, but as the webinar goes around, I will share as many of the responses as I get to. You guys are really active responders, and so you'll see these populating in the question box, but I have to answer them in order for you all to see each other's responses, which we want you to do. So just keep an eye on that as we go.
All right, so thanks everyone for your responses. I'm going to turn it over now to Katie.
Great, thank you. Well, and so what I loved is I was hearing Sandra kind of share out the responses. The responses were really grounded in the shifts of the CCSS and the shifts in, as we talk about college and career readiness. And as I'm sure you guys have heard, if you've attended some of our webinars before, the shifts are really the basis of high quality instruction. But what sometimes gets overlooked is that the shifts really apply to all aspects of education. So not only your instruction, also your materials, and also, you know, what we're going to talk about today, which is assessment. Now, if you've been attending previous webinars, you've kind of seen how these shifts apply to practice and materials. I know in August you talked about, you know, working with instructional materials that aren't necessarily perfectly aligned. You know, in previous webinars, you've also talked about how to incorporate conversations around the shifts in the standards into your PLCs. Really what we want to focus on tonight is talking about how these shifts can apply to assessment to really create a coherent experience for all students. So over the next couple slides, we'll show some comparisons of test passages and test items, that some that meet the shifts and some that do not, and you can think about both what that means for your classroom assessment and also what that means for your classroom practice. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we'll dive right in and talk about shift one, and here you see a traditional text and a complex text. As you know, shift one is all about regular practice with complex text and its academic language.
A traditional science text may sound like this. Have you ever noticed that bubbles have colors? Look closely and you can see lots of pre-colors on bubbles. The colors happen when light falls on bubbles. Then the light goes from the bubbles to your eyes. Next time you see bubbles, look to see what colors they are. Do you see green or blue, purple or yellow? Sometimes you can see a rainbow.
And a more complex science test may sound something like this. Bubbles can also teach us about light. The light from the sun is made up of many different colors. Mixed together, they look white. However, it is possible to separate the different colors of each light from each other with the prism. Small drops of water or ice crystals can work like a prism. You have seen this for yourself if you've ever seen a rainbow.
So we know it's impossible to demonstrate, all of the aspects of text complexity in these really short samples. But as you see, on this slide, the difference between a non-complex text and a complex text is pretty sharp, and that's especially true of assessment. Notice in the traditional text the lack of sentence complexity, the very simple vocabulary and simple sentence structures. We've also got some kind of incomplete development of ideas, and so students are trying to fill in the blanks like about bubbles, which could potentially lead to inaccurate and incorrect inferences. That really stands in sharp contrast when you look at, both of these texts were put on assessments at grade 5, but you look at the more complex texts and there's so much more for students to dig into. There, the academic vocabulary and the connections between ideas really pushes students to think deeply about bubbles. So when you're thinking about the implications for your classroom practice, of course this means that, if students are seeing complex text in assessment, you're preparing them with complex text in your classroom. Something that I think is really, kind of important to note is that just as you as teachers are using a two-step process to determine if a passage is appropriately complex for your students, where you first measure quantitatively using something like Lexile or Flesch-Kincaid, and then do a qualitative analysis looking at features like text structure and knowledge demands, assessment developers are using that exact same process. So again, if you're thinking about, an implication of Shift 1 and ensuring complex text for your classroom, using a two-step process to make sure that texts are really appropriate for whatever grade level of students is important, and it's something that's happening in assessments just as it's happening in instructional materials and classroom practice. If you want to go to the next slide. So the other part of Shift 1, is, as you can see, is focusing on the academic language. We won't read this slide to you. You can kind of get the gist by just skimming over it. But what you see in the traditional item is not testing an academic phrase, not testing one of those Tier 2 vocabulary words that students are going to see across a variety of contexts, but rather just testing, but who knew, a phrase that's maybe interesting or, kind of a window dressing type phrase. There's not really a payoff for students to use context to determine the meaning of that phrase. What's the point in really understanding what that phrase means for this text? It doesn't, I know you can't see the whole text, but it doesn't really connect to central ideas of the text or the challenging scientific concepts in this text. On the flip side, when you look at the, we've noted it's a CCS aligned item, but this is very much an item that aligns to the shifts, and you would see it in any of the states that have chosen college and career ready standards. That word circulate is very much a word students are going to see across a variety of contexts. They're going to see it in science text just as much as they're going to see it in all different types of text. It's very much that Tier 2 academic vocabulary. Further, there's definitely sufficient context for students to figure out what that word or phrase means. You can see a little bit of paragraph 2 here, but the entire mini assessment for this text is on Achieve the Core, so if you're interested, you can go and check it out and see that there's a lot there for students to grab onto in order to figure out that that word is really about the way blood travels. So again, if we're taking it back to our classroom practice, what does this mean? Well, we want to be teaching that Tier 2 academic vocabulary that's going to apply across many different contexts. And additionally, we want to be really focusing in on that general academic vocab where there's sufficient context for kids to be able to pick out and figure out what it means. So again, as you're jotting down your notes that's in the handout, that's kind of something to grab onto there. Moving right along to Shift 2, Shift 2 is all about reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text. Now, traditionally in assessment, we've all seen these decontextualized writing prompts where kids are given kind of any topic to write about, and they can use whatever evidence they want to support their point, and they can draw on personal experience or anything like that to make an argument or make a claim or explain a topic or write a narrative. And those are fine prompts. They can be used in the classroom sometimes, but really what you see in the CCSS and shifts-aligned writing prompts are those prompts where kids have to use evidence to support a point. So the contrast here, write an essay in which you provide an opinion that Marco Polo told the truth or made it up. Be sure to use information from text to support your opinion. Kids have to go back into those two texts and pull facts and pull details in order to support their point. Now you'll notice that their ability to read is kind of tested in this, and that's okay because we really want to know, do kids get what they're reading? Do they understand it? And can they then build a coherent argument or build a coherent explanation about a text? Now, thinking again about classroom practice, as you well know with Shift 2, your classroom activities should be grounded in text. We want to move away from writing prompts that are totally grounded in student experience. Of course, personal experience is totally a type of evidence that kids can use, and we want them to be able to use it effectively. But that's just a type of evidence, and we want to be sure that kids can really ground their arguments and ground their what they write about in evidence from text. So if we want to move to the next slide. The last shift, Shift 3, is all about building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction, and so we'll look at kind of another comparison of text here to think about this shift.
A traditional assessment text may sound like this. Lake Baikal is not only the deepest lake in the world, it is unusual in many other ways. It has a lot of biodiversity. More than 1,500 species of animals and plants live in the lake, many of which cannot be found living anywhere else in the world. There are especially a lot of snails and shrimp-like animals everywhere in the lake, enjoying its cool temperatures and clean, deep water. Scientists travel from all over the world to study the many life forms living in Lake Baikal.
And a content-rich assessment text may sound something like this. Scientists have also discovered that Lake Baikal contains a large variety of living things. For example, there are 147 species of snails and 255 species of shrimp-like animals. Most of the plant and animal species in the lake are found nowhere else. A comparison to Lake Tahoe in Nevada shows how unusual such biodiversity is. Lake Baikal, Tahoe was formed by movement of tectonic plates, but it is a much younger lake and only has 2 native species. Baikal has as many as 1,500. Many of the species in Baikal have survived from prehistoric times, giving scientists important insights into early life forms.
I always laugh when I see this example because I totally remember writing assessment text, like that traditional assessment text on the left, where there's not really a ton of information. Kids don't really learn a lot about Lake Baikal in that text. Not only that, but you can tell it was written by someone who's maybe not a scientist. Think about that language. There are especially a lot of snails and shrimp-like animals everywhere in the lake, enjoying its cool temperatures and clean, deep water. While there's certainly nothing wrong with personifying animals, you don't usually see that in a, rich scientific type text. Especially in contrast to that content-rich assessment text, where kids really actually are learning about this lake as they're reading. There's tons of factual information, and not only that, it reads like something that a scientist would have written. That certainly doesn't mean that it's like super hard and, something that it's impossible for kids to grab onto. This text actually is deemed appropriate for middle school students. But I think representing the best of the genre is really important, and that's something we can get at with our content-rich nonfiction. So again, thinking back to the classroom, we need to be intentional and ensuring that students are building knowledge from the text they read. We are not, by any stretch of the imagination, throwing out literary text. You are going to see literary text on high-quality assessment, and your kids are seeing literary text in great classrooms. The difference really here is ensuring that students have the opportunity to build knowledge about the topics that they read, and ensuring that they're reading, when they are reading nonfiction, that they're reading really great stuff that they're learning from, at every step along the way. I see a note too that they love the academic language in text 2, and yes, I totally agree. Text 2 really gets that academic language in a beautiful way. So thanks for pointing that out. So I know we've been we went through that really fast, and you probably didn't have a ton of time to jot down some notes, but we'd love to hear, using that questions tab, what are some of the key takeaways that you see as you compare assessment packages and items? And, how will your classroom instruction and assessment practice change, thinking about these key takeaways? So what are some of the implications you see as we shift to college and career ready standards and these types of instructional practices? And again, use that questions tab to share your thoughts.
Great. So again, more answers than I can even come up with here, keep up with, but I will continue sharing them. I loved one comment was, I'm always looking for opportunities within assessment moments to teach, and I think that's one of our hopes throughout all of this, which is, that this is not just about assessment implications. There's a close tie to instructional implications. Another great comment to share was someone who said, let's think about this beyond the test or beyond the standards, but really this is the kind of writing and reading that students should be doing in real life, and that's actually what we're preparing students for. So lots of comments about the kind of text and looking at text and thinking about high quality text, not just in instruction, but also in assessment. Somebody else mentioned, when you have a good test that includes rich texts and good tasks, isn't that what we mean by good teaching to a test? And so appreciate all those comments, and I'll be sharing the questions as the webinar proceeds.
And so now we come to our first poll. Which shift most frames the changes that you want to make in your classroom instruction and assessment practice? Please select one, and we will give you a few minutes to make that choice.
All right, well, it's great to see there's such I really have a heavy kind of emphasis. It's great to see all the shifts in assessment, right? But I love seeing the heavy emphasis on complex text and its academic vocabulary. There's certainly not a right or a wrong answer to this one, but one of the biggest challenges I think sometimes is really making sure that the texts we put on our assessments are high quality and appropriately complex for students. There was just a comment made that if you don't really have an authentic, high quality text, there's going to be, but you're teaching with those, there's going to be a misalignment and you're not going to get good information from that assessment. And that's definitely true. So really striving to ensure that the assessment texts that you use to choose to assess your students with are high quality and appropriately complex. And, choosing to check your students with those academic vocabulary words is a big step in the right direction. So with that, I think we are going to turn it over to math.
The math portion, similar question. How can the characteristics of high-quality assessments help shape classroom instruction and assessment practices in math? But once again, before we start, we have a question for you.
So what words, phrases, sentences do you associate with high-quality, standards-aligned mathematics instruction? Please use your question box to answer this question.
So again, some great answers that really show that you guys have been at this work for a while, which is awesome to see, and love that you're now interested in applying this to the world of assessment. So things that I read, some of the many responses is learning progressions, allowing the struggle, perseverance, definitely a lot of focus, major work, problem solving, representation, some of the language that we saw earlier in the literacy section, explain, use evidence, reasoning. So all of those are great. Thank you. So now I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Astrid.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so it's really nice to see some of that same language of the instructional shifts and coming through in the question from before. As in the earlier portion of the webinar, there was a handout around just kind of tracking information for shift-aligned instructional practice and assessment work. We're going to ask you to fill that out throughout this portion of the webinar as well for some further implications. So when we think about these math shifts, just remembering that just with ELA, these are really the basis of high-quality instruction, and they apply to instructional practice and materials. The shifts of focus, coherence, and rigor are what we're going to dig into a little bit more, and we're going to share some illustrations of these shifts in assessment in particular, focusing strongly where the standards focus, some progression and coherence, and then thinking about the shift of rigor in particular around balancing between concepts, procedures, and application. So with that, we'll look at this first example around the shift of focus. Here you'll notice two tables. These are set up as sort of like hypothetical score reports. You'll notice the traditional summative assessment, grade 6, treating each domain as equal content and emphasis, with the number of score points, or the percentage of score points actually being distributed evenly across the items. That would mean that we would have a 53% of the percentage for that assessment would be aligned to major work of the grade, not really focusing on the content needed for success in later mathematics, versus the standards aligned summative assessment has 78% of the score points are in the major work of the grade at 6th grade in ratios and proportional relationships, in the number system, and in expressions and equations. I think with this you can draw a parallel to instructional materials when we think about implications for day-to-day practice too, that we're making sure that this shift of focus lives in assessment and lives in materials as well. You can almost imagine that these are in a book that we would say isn't very standards aligned, treats every topic with equal intensity, and so we have every chapter just kind of going through equally distributed across the domains, whereas a focused material would be spending more time on the major work of the grade. So we want to think about this shift of focus across and through our whole instructional cycle. We also have a first grade example of an item that really shows how focus can connect when we're thinking about supporting content, enhancing focus of the major work of the grade. The item on the right, the aligned item, is asking students to respond to how many more, how many less type of questions, whereas this traditional approach, or this item for first grade that we have seen in the past, is more simply like a counting exercise for students. How many had milk? How many had punch? Where we know we can see in the other example that the students are really solving addition and subtraction, which is major work for first grade. So take a minute to jot any notes on the handout for that first shift of coherence, and we're going to move into first shift of focus, and we're going to move into coherence. So with the progression that we see right illustrated here, you're going to notice that there's a focus on area. And, you know, it is typically like when I was a building coach, I'd walk through the building, and in grades 3, 4, 5 downstairs, everyone was working on area and perimeter. I'd walk upstairs and we'd see sort of like the same lesson happening in 6th grade as well. And this traditional progression is illustrated through this content. I think you can see is how assessment was approached at that time too. You'll notice that there's really no increase in the numbers going from grade to grade, even in 6th grade. Really just like the magnitude or the types of these numbers are pretty small whole numbers. Whereas when we're moving into an aligned progression on this next slide, you'll see that the numbers increase in magnitude. We're moving from within 20 to within 1,000. Take some time to look. 5th grade has the fraction examples there. We're going to 10,000s and general rational numbers in the 6th grade example. So there's increasing complexity with the magnitude of numbers here, as well as in the types of questions that are used to assess similar topics that progress from grade to grade. And we often are asked about the idea or the question about test prep. And I think the shift of coherence speaks to that as well. I mean, if instruction and content are really building from year to year, then we're preparing our students in the classroom every day and for the assessments that they're going to take. I mean, simply like repeating content from grade to grade doesn't really help students perform or understand any better. We need to really think about this growing progression and how to move and connect content within the grade as well as from from grade to grade. Again, take a minute to look at the handout and really think about some of the implications there for the shift of coherence. And we're going to move into the third and final shift for mathematics, which is rigor. And rigor speaks to really spending equal time and intensity on concepts, procedures, and application. This is addressed in instruction as well as in assessment. No longer are we just assessing procedure, procedure, procedure. You'll see two conceptual illustrations here on the slide. Kind of that traditional approach where students are simply filling in, going in order, what's in the hundreds place, what's in the tens place, what's in the ones place. This is a good exercise for following directions. Whereas the mini assessment example for second grade for a standards aligned approach is really thinking about the understanding of bundling 106 in different ways. The language in the standards themselves will ask students to explain or interpret or understand, and that will help in ensuring that we're meeting this idea of conceptual understanding. The illustrations for procedural skill are actually very similar. The key difference really being that the items in the standards aligned example are, we've got unknowns in different positions. You'll also see the mix between multiplication and division, whereas students, I think, traditionally have moved from one operation to the next. Another key difference is that the problems are given here horizontally, whereas in the vertical orientation in the traditional approach simply implies that there's a paper and pencil calculation to do just by the way the items are set up. So practicing to become fluent really means that you're going to know these from memory and should be able to just fill that blank in horizontally. Finally, we have an illustration for assessing application. The traditional approach, those items are simply all add to, result unknown. Similar structure, a very traditional way to think about these items and the problem situations for grade 2, ignoring the other 14 problem formats. Whereas on the right, for the standards aligned approach, we're thinking about varying situation types, put together total unknowns, compare different unknowns, and these are all appropriate for grade 2. So you'll see that mixed in the application there. So in thinking about these three aspects of rigor, you're taking these shifts back to classroom practice, again, balancing rigor in instruction and balancing rigor with concepts, procedures, and application, materials, and instruction. So you've been thinking about and capturing notes, hopefully a few notes on the key shifts in assessment and mathematics, and there's a few questions on the implications column here to think about, and we're going to ask you to respond to these. Key takeaways from comparisons of the assessment items and tasks in mathematics, and how will your classroom instruction and assessment practices change as you consider these takeaways. We'll give you a minute to respond in the box or question tab.
Great. So again, good answers, everyone. Thanks for submitting them. I like the idea of really thinking differently about the entire breadth of the standard, not just kind of topic. People talked about looking at each component and the real meaning behind the standard in designing assessments. Somebody referred to assessments that actually progress across the grade levels, which I think is a great observation. This idea of really thinking about concepts and not tricking ourselves into thinking that that's in fact what we're testing when we're testing procedure or memorization. So in the interest of time, we'll keep on going, but I'll keep sharing these great responses with all of you.
And so we have another poll. Which shift most frames the changes you want to make in your classroom instruction and assessment practices? Please select one. We'll give you just a few seconds to choose an answer. It's about 30 seconds. Okay, going to close that out and share the results.
Interesting. Yeah, we think about like the content at the grade level, how important that is, and now that we're having that emphasis on focus strongly where the standard focus, I think that the other two shifts kind of come into play, you know, once we've, in a sense, sort of tackled focus. There was a comment around really looking at assessments across a school or a K-5 or K-8 setting. And I think that's such a powerful activity to really think about coherence across the grades. Sometimes I've heard people mention things like, well, our 5th grade assessment was harder than our 6th grade assessment. And what a great vertical planning activity to really pull out some assessments that are given across the grades and see, like, how is this content really building from grade to grade? And what are the expectations that we have for our students, especially in the areas of major work? And then that really how rigor plays in there too. So thank you.
All right, so I'm sure most of our webinar attendees are now thinking, since they understand how the shifts live in assessment, how do we find some tools to help ensure that classroom instruction and assessments are actually aligned? So at this time, I'm excited to introduce our guest core advocate, Christy Gettleman, who is the district math leader in Milwaukee Public Schools, to share some of the tools that she's used.
Thanks, Joni. So right away, the first thing that comes to my mind is what's already out there, right? We hear all this stuff about making sure that instruction and assessment are aligned to the shift. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So what do we already have? And so when looking at this slide, the two things that come to my mind first are the practice tests that are available from the Smarter Balance and PARC consortia, because these practice tests are developed by people who have kept the Common Core standards and the shifts in mind, and they're deemed as high quality. So there's not a lot of guesswork involved. And regardless of whether your state belongs to the consortia or not, the practice tests are available to everyone. In Wisconsin, we're not part of either consortia right now, but we can absolutely use those practice tests both in the classroom to instruct students in the kind of thinking that they need to get engaged with around the shifts, and also an assessment to see if our kids are really meeting the requirements of the standards. The first item on this slide, the Achieve the Core mini assessments, is what we're going to talk about next. So on the Student Achievement Partners website, achievethecore.org, which you see along the bottom of the slide, Under classroom resources, there are ELA and literacy assessments available, and there's also mathematics assessments available. And the math mini assessments are tools that I've used personally with work with teachers in our districts. We've taken some of the math mini assessments as is and distributed them out to teachers at schools across our district. They're a great source for teachers to use to collect evidence for standards-based grading. And it's also a nice piece to use as PD to sit down with teachers in PLCs and look at some of these assessments and talk about, does the instruction that we're crafting and planning for our students prepare them to be successful on these assessments? The other piece that's nice about these mini assessments is they're not with a specific program. So we can use assessments that come with textbook programs, but we want to make sure that our students are prepared and understanding the standards, not just a program's interpretation of the standards. And so these mini assessments are a great tool for that. And then when we can't find things, or when we find things online or from other places and we want to check and see, are they aligned to the shifts, are they aligned to the Common Core, there's a few places that we can go to help us with that. And so Achieve the Core has tons of professional development modules. If you look at the third and fourth rows on this table, it talks about shifts in assessment, PowerPoint, and the item alignment modules. Those are professional development modules that you can use back in school with teachers, with staff, to help teachers understand the shifts in assessment a little bit more. But the assessment evaluation tool is something I'd like to speak a little bit more about now. It's a great resource. If we go to the next slide, that you can use to evaluate assessments, evaluate course assessments, or evaluate grade level assessments, and look and see, are they aligned to the shifts? Are these high quality assessments that students should be getting to assess their understanding? And so the assessment evaluation tool is designed for summative comprehensive assessment. And the language in the assessment evaluation tool was helpful when I was doing some work with some math coaches in Milwaukee, where we were trying to put together benchmark assessments for students. And we actually used the language of that tool to help us frame our assessments and make sure that we were, one specific example was thinking about a balance of rigor. When we were putting together assessments, we were looking for some really high-level thinking, critical thinking assessments, and we needed to make sure that the assessments weren't all focusing on conceptual understanding, or they weren't all focusing on procedural skill and fluency. And the assessment evaluation tool helped us keep that in check, that we needed to have a balance of each of those aspects of rigor. There's also item quality checklists to evaluate smaller scale assessment tasks or items as well, both for math and for language arts.
Great. So now let's start thinking about actions we want you to think about what your next steps are going to be according to the information you have heard here tonight. Instructional advocacy. Which tool are you most likely to check out the most?
So I'm sitting with Astrid, and she's cheering about the fact that the mini assessments have showed up the most. Definitely, if you have not checked those out, those are a great resource on achievethecore.org to both for teacher PD and for students to use.
so just another reminder that we do have our Instructional Advocacy Action Form. So after you check out those mini assessments, we would love to hear about how you use them in your setting, whether you use them with students, whether you use them with other teachers for professional learning opportunities. Be sure that you tell us about it, and you can use either the hyperlink in the recorded webinar that you'll receive in the next day or two, or you'll be receiving a friendly email reminder in about a month to tell us about the work that you're doing. So we are running out of time here, but we do have a minute or two to answer any lingering questions that you might have. So please use the question box. We'll pause for just a minute to allow you the opportunity to ask us some of your questions.
Joni, we have one question, well, actually two questions related to the mini assessments. One is, will there be more mini assessments developed? And do the mini assessments cover high school topics in math?
There are 22 mini assessments for mathematics right now. 21 of them are in grades 2 through 8. And there is one high school mini assessment that focuses on quadratics. Right now, we're unsure of when and how, when others will be added. But that would be something that when we know, they're usually posted through the newsletter, or if there have been tweaks or revisions to anything, we'll let you know through that vehicle as well, and Twitter.
So one other thing to add, really important, and if you didn't already know and haven't looked at the coherence maps in math, that we now have assessment items integrated into those coherence maps. So that's another really great resource that ties together this idea of progressions, instruction with quality assessment tasks. So encourage you to look at that too.
All right, thank you for your questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And I would like to just finish off tonight by thanking all of our guests and our Core Advocate presenter, and inviting all of you to join us again next month, where we'll talk about using InCommon to integrate content understanding and writing. And that'll happen on Wednesday, December 7th at this same time from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And the link is available on the recording. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and go check out that World Series game.